Okay, I think we have a quorum. Of all the speakers today, maybe aside from the king and the prime minister, the one who least needs an introduction is Amos. So we'll skip the introductions. I want to start, though, with a question that isn't very substantive, but it's actually kind of organizational. As a veteran of two White Houses, the Bush White House and the Obama White House, I'm not familiar with your job. So can you explain how is it that at this point President Biden created this position, which is unusual because it cuts across not only functional areas, but regional. So how are you so lucky to be here in this position?
Wow. That's a heck of a way to start.
Maybe you should ask President Biden.
If he comes, I think you should address that question to him. First, thank you for skipping the introduction. That's my least favorite part of any talk, so I really appreciate it. Look, I think that the challenges that we face in a world of inflection require different kind of solutions and different kind of organization. And I think what happened was, I think we recognized that one, some of the things that the president really wants to work out you need somebody at the White House to bring in the whole of government, to bring in to work with him to address the challenges by getting implementation to be a lot faster. And you are right about two things. One, the job doesn't exist in the normal org chart structure, and it cuts through a number of different areas. One is the domestic as well as the international, the national security implications, and it's trying to do things very differently. We have, in this moment of inflection of where the world is trying to figure itself out, we have a war in Ukraine, a war of aggression in Ukraine, we have changes in the Middle East, how we address our relationship, our complicated relationship with China, India, the need to focus on an energy transition and what does that mean and how do you do it so that it is both done right and justly and equally, more and more equally than it has been. A low and middle income countries that are poised to be the majority of the world as we go further into the 21st century. So all these things are difficult. And to do that, the president has wanted to do a number of things quickly. One is, as we pass legislation in the United States, whether it's the trio of the infrastructure, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act, and the IRA, and the worst thing to do in Washington is get the legislation, but then with all this money, but then you're stuck in a bureaucracy that can't implement. So how do we drive implementation as quickly as possible because we are in a race against time on implementation here? And then look at the international picture and say, how do I bring everything else up? Because the infrastructure is not there to support it. So we have to make the investment. And how we drive capital and not trying to make believe that we can do it the way we always have, which is much more through the lens of development assistance versus investment. And I don't think it should be one versus the other, but we've only done one and we haven't really done the other. So let's continue the development assistance, which is so critical, but let's actually build out an investment strategy. To do that, we have to have US capital, US government capital. We have to augment that with our allies. So bring in the EU, the G7, et cetera, and then bring in the capital from the private sector, whether it's from banks, private equity, as well as sovereign wealth funds, and use the MDBs, the multilateral development banks and regional development banks, to be able to get to a better implementation. To do that, you need someone to be able to oversee it. And I think it's very difficult to live through doing, in the energy side, two big things, and that is accelerate the energy transition on the one hand, and make sure that we still have a functioning energy market of today while we accelerate. So to do that for the domestic economy, to grow the global economy, and to invest around the world, that's pretty much the job. So the fancy title, or the nondescript title of Senior Advisor to the President for Energy and Investment, I think it is.
And Special Coordinator and so forth.
So,
Well, look, the job may be new, but we've already seen your work. the product of your work. We've seen the Israeli-Lebanon gas agreement. Is there a prospect here that that sort of cooperation could move beyond gas, offshore gas?
To where?
Well, maybe ashore.
Clarifying the question before I answer it.
Other boundaries between these two countries. I mean, is there a chance that this could be a catalyst for additional cooperation?
What you refer to as the gas deal, I would say it as the maritime boundary agreement.
Fair enough.
Right? Gas was an incentive and a change in the opportunity scale that allowed us to get to it. But at the end of the day, what happened in the maritime agreement was the ability for the very first time between these two countries to settle any border. And it is a border. It's a maritime border, but it's a maritime boundary that was agreed to with both countries agreeing to the same coordinates. They didn't do it with each other, although we were in a tent, a UN tent all together, the US, the UN, the Israelis, and the Lebanese. And that proved something, that it's possible. And I got to tell you, everybody told me it wasn't possible, which is why it happened, because then everybody leaves you alone. They think you're crazy, and you go and negotiate something, and you can actually have some space. But I really credit both countries at the time walked away from the naysayers to do it. To me, we should always be creating precedents and say, okay, nothing is exactly the same, but it sure should be a precedent for other things that we can do. Now, does that mean that we can demarcate the boundary? I was clear. I went to Lebanon to look at it a few weeks. I don't remember, 2-3 weeks ago. I flew over the land boundary with the help of our friends in UNIFIL. I flew out to the Bekaa. I wanted to see to take the temperature, to see, is this possible? I'm an optimist. I believe things are possible. I also believe that for Lebanon's sake, it is entirely in their interest to have stability. What the gas field showed was that after 10 years of talking about why is Lebanon the only Mediterranean country without exploration, and everybody's saying like a broken record, it's because companies, multi-billion-dollar companies, don't invest in areas that could go to war, and you don't sink a few $100 million into something that could go into conflict. When you settle the conflict and you say, no, now it's secure and it's knowable, then the lawyers say we're good, the insurance company says we're good, the risk committee says we're good, and you can have the investment. And guess what? Everybody told me it won't actually happen even if we get to the maritime. It did. And the rig is there, it's drilling. Now, I don't know if it's going to discover commercial gas. That's out of my hands. But I don't think it's the last rig to arrive in the area, whether or not it's a dry hole or it's a good discovery. There's already other interest. And there's already job creation. There's already investment in Lebanon. That's the message. If you get your act together, you can actually get more additional investment in, and Lebanon doesn't have to be the economic basket case that it is. And I'm using harsh words, but somebody's got to wake up, or enough people in Lebanon have to wake up and say, this is a disaster. And it's unfair that a political class is not going to say to its people, you have every right to be able to be successful. Lebanese run businesses in every country in the planet. Wherever you go, there are Lebanese entrepreneurs and doctors and CEOs and financiers. But they have to leave Lebanon to do it, and there's no reason for that. They can do it in Lebanon. But I think if we can get the border straight, if we can get the reform agenda addressed, then I think the sky's the limit. And I believe, and we, the United States, should be there to support it.
Well, another big idea was just announced recently at the G20, and this is this trade rail corridor linking India through the Middle East to Europe. So can you put a little meat on those bones? I mean, what's the ambition here, and what kind of timelines do you imagine?
So we definitely don't lack an ambition. So what President Biden was able to announce together with his partners, in this case the EU, the United States, India, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and a number of the EU member states that were there and relevant to the project, is look, we can connect. We've talked for decades about connecting Asia to Europe, but we've never actually done it. And here we actually have the opportunity to do it. So you basically think about it as you go from, and people talked about the rail project, and no, we don't have a secret recipe for rail in the oceans. It's a ship, you connect the ports from India to UAE. You have the rail that goes all the way through UAE, Saudi, north to Jordan, sort of north, and then across to the Haifa port. And from there, again, you connect to rail, probably to Greece, Italy, and beyond. What that does, one, it makes the transportation cheaper because it's shorter, faster, cleaner, less diesel on the ships. You don't have to go all the way around. You make it a lot more efficient of using the combination of ship and rail. It opens the goods up in both directions, from Europe to the subcontinent and other way around. If there can be investment that we are looking at to expand the Indian rail to Vietnam, to Myanmar, you're starting to look at really how to move goods in a much faster and more efficient way around the world. But in order not to stop the ambition there, what comes with it if you're already doing this kind of a project? What do you need? What are the ingredients to really tying economies together? You need data. In other words, in our world today, you need high-speed data connection, fiber optic connectivity from the subcontinent to the Middle East, and from the offshore in the Mediterranean, connecting with the Blue Ramen project that's already being built for fiber. The Middle East has an opportunity to replicate its role of the 20th century supplier of energy to the world to being the supplier of clean energy to the world. It has abundant sun, quite a bit of wind, and a lot cheaper and available land, which is costly. So if you can generate enough electricity, which I know both Saudi and Saudi, Qatar, UAE, others have talked about being able to manufacture, but at the end of the day, they're in trapped markets that don't have the capacity to absorb that much more electricity than their ambition. So if you can connect by cable, subsea cable all the way to Greece and Italy, and from there you're basically connected into the European grid, and have both clean electricity as well as clean hydrogen, you're starting to transform the clean energy transition into reality by understanding that you have to get to the places of production of generation, and instead of we always transported molecules, now we can transport the electrons instead. And I think this is worthy of the ambition. I think the finance is there. Being able to go through Israel breaks the logjam that has always been there. I know it's not step one of normalization. This is on its own. And we're very excited about it. Timelines, we're going to start. We committed to putting working groups together quite in the next, let's say, 60 to 90 days. We want to be able to build financial vehicles. And we didn't just announce this MOU because we came up with the idea 2 weeks earlier. This really started when President Biden went to Jeddah to see both the Crown Prince, and then the next day the Jeddah summit with the GCC+3. And that's when we started this conversation. So it's taken us a year to actually build this out and think about it. And we've had a number of meetings here. The UAE has been a driving force behind it. Saudi Arabia is a big proponent of it. So I think we were able to be off to the races.
You know, some might argue that this is actually a geostrategic alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative. How would you respond to that? Is it an
I've heard that argument.
Is it an updated version of Belt and Road?
I think Belt and Road is offering their offering. We're trying to suggest that there's not one way to do things. I believe that investment, when we talk about investments in countries, if we don't look at the Middle East for a moment, but you look at what we're trying to do in Sub-Saharan Africa and in Latin America and in Southeast Asia, I think if you look at the offerings, it should be this. Are the investments actually coming in just to take minerals or resources, or are they 10 years later? You tell me. Are you in more debt now than you were in before? If you are, walk away. If you are do you have children that are working in these facilities and there's child labor is rife? Walk away. If your workers in these facilities, these factories, or these mills, or these or the mines are walking home on dirt roads to dark homes, to towns without a school and a city without a hospital after 10 years of so-called investment, then you've gotten the raw deal here. And I think that what we should do as the United States, together with the G7 allies plus, is not come and say, I want I'm here for your resources or I'm here for other purposes, then I'm doing the same thing. We have to have a different offering that says, no, we want to bring companies of international reputation that will adhere to internationally recognized labor standards, environmental standards that lift the communities. If we're not doing that, we shouldn't do it either. That's the minimum standard. And I think we can do that. And I'll tell you, wherever I go, when they tell me one thing, we'd go with your companies. They're just not here. They're not bidding. Look at the bid rounds. It's usually a sole source bid, or I got 3 companies from the same country. So we have to encourage the companies to do that, but I can't compete dollar for dollar with China, nor should I. That's what the private sector should do, but the private sector comes in and says, wait a minute, I got currency risk, commodity risk, political risk, reputational risk. So my job as the international community, as governments, as international institutions, as for regional development banks and the World Bank, is say, how do I mitigate those risks? How do I actually create facilities that can do local currency lending? Because otherwise, how do I hedge the currency? How do I mitigate the reputational risk, and how do I mitigate the political risk through structures? How do I bring in enough capital that says that the investment is less costly and therefore the returns don't have to be as outrageous as they are in middle and low income countries compared to doing it in Denmark or Minnesota? A year ago, we had this conversation with the private sector, with private finance, and we were told, no thanks. We're not interested. There's plenty of investments to do, and we have where to go. And today, that's, to me, the biggest success of this, is that today, they're coming to us and asking for the conversation. We want to be in these markets. But we have to live up to us. So we're putting real money in a way that we've never have before. We are investing in rail in Africa. We're investing in critical minerals in Brazil. We're actually putting the investments into infrastructure. And I think that's the key element.
Well, you mentioned in your opening that, and one of the topics that's dominating New York this week at the General Assembly is the war in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And if anything, maybe the top repercussion of the war has been the re-engineering of the global energy market as Russia has been increasingly shut off. So the question is, have we transitioned fast enough? So we've largely been successful in weaning European allies off of Russian energy, not completely, but actually quite impressively. Have those alternatives been quick enough to the scene? We're about to enter another European winter. We were graced last year with a relatively mild European winter. How do we stand this year in year 2 of the war?
So when you ask the question, is it fast enough? It's hard to answer that question because fast enough compared to what, right?
Well, the demand.
Because 3 years ago, if you told anybody Europe can move away from Russian gas almost entirely, I'd be laughed out of the room. In fact, I was laughed out of the room when just before the war started, because the gas crunch in Europe started by Russia a lot before the war started. 6 months earlier, they stopped supplying. And so we were able to see where we were headed. I think it's been I tip my hat to what the EU has done and some of the member states. Europe has done an unbelievable job under very difficult circumstances. And just imagine in the United States where Europe has had to go through in this process to be in this much better position. Today, gas, I think, there are a lot of people in the room that I can see here know prices more up to date than I do, but I think it's about $11 or $12 an MMBTU in natural gas. Not long ago, it was at 100. So it went from 2 to 50, 60 to 100. Now translate that in the United States context. If we had a conflict that led our gasoline prices, which if you want to equate energy from public opinion, it's natural gas in Europe and oil/gasoline, diesel in the United States. It's stratospheric. It would be very, very difficult. And yet Europe persevered. It didn't come around and say, you know what, this is too difficult, I'm going back to the Russian gas. Now, I'm proud that the United States was able to step up. We worked very closely with Europe. We were able to somewhat re-engineer a little bit of the international market. We worked with countries that were suppliers that had destination clauses to waive them so that others outside of Europe that had purchased that gas would be able to resell it into Europe. So that allowed for the surge of LNG into Europe to get some of the neighbors around Europe that supply pipeline gas. So we did all the right things. We got blessed with a relatively mild winter, as you said, and we'll see what the winter. Forecasting is not my thing, but I think Europe has put itself in the best place possible to be able to handle even if it's a cold winter. If it's a very cold winter, it's going to be more difficult. So all these headlines that we're out of the woods, everything's great, we're at 95% fill in the reserves. I think I'm an optimist, but I'm fairly guarded that I'm going to hold my breath the entire winter, and when we get to April, I'll have a
We'll
big
ask you
exhale. So we'll
So
see.
we just heard from, last question, we just heard from Prime Minister al-Sudani. And here's a country that has vast energy resources, but still struggles with persistent inefficiencies, blockages, and so forth. The Iraq-Turkey pipeline is not operational, right? Gas is not integrated across the north and the south. In fact, mostly it's not produced at all, it's flared, right? We've got a major challenge in terms of regional integration because next door is the third largest gas producer in the world, Iran, and we've got political and sanctions challenges there. So how does your office deal across the US government with a case like Iraq, which has almost all the problems possible in terms of energy integration and efficiency?
So in the case of Iraq, first of all, the opportunities are great. They really are great. And energy and politics are always one. They're intertwined because energy is somewhere in the 80, 90, 95% of actual revenues at the end of the day. So therefore, it's the bloodline of the country, and therefore hard to separate it between the politics between Baghdad and Erbil, the politics inside Baghdad. I think that Prime Minister Soudani has done, I admire his steady hand in a very, very complicated political situation in Baghdad. I think we can do a lot more. I think it's critical that for Iraq to grow, we have to get rid of some of these disagreements. So one, I've traveled to Baghdad and to Erbil. My friends in Kurdistan know that I've advocated that everybody there have a united front. They're in a tough time economically. Focusing on the big picture versus the disagreements between the two major parties in Kurdistan and KRG is critical to be able to succeed. I think Baghdad has taken some strong steps recently in addressing the budget of how managing between Baghdad and Erbil. I think that's important. I think that's a positive step. We have to make it more permanent, more regular. The offshore in Iraq is of immense opportunity. I don't want to, but I think we criticize too much. I think if you look at where we were, my first trip to Baghdad in the Obama administration, my first trip was in the 90s, but in the Obama administration was in 2011, I believe. And I did not believe that we would be at the production levels where we are today. So the projections were much smaller of where we would get to, and we've done fairly well, or Iraq's done fairly well. But it's a drop in the bucket compared to what the opportunity is. And if they can figure out the relationship between the government and the companies and not think about the short-term profit of what do I get right now versus not what's the size of my slice, but what's the size of the pie, I think it would serve all Iraqis, specifically the people. Flaring gas today in Iraq is mind-boggling. I mean, I remember over 10 years ago going and standing at a U.S. military-funded GE gas-fired power plant that was using mazout in the power plant, and I can see and smell the stacks of burning gas just a few kilometers away. That hasn't changed enough. That has to change. Reopening the pipeline between KRG and Turkey is something that I believe is critical. We have to get to a better system of understanding of what the rules of the road are between Turkey, folks in Erbil, and in Baghdad. so that we can grow that potential. That is good for Iraq, it's good for Turkey, it's good for the region, it's good for, you asked me about European energy security, the ability to have a supply line that goes through is good. If you look at where the demand is right now for hydrocarbons, it's fairly high, it's robust. We're trying to accelerate the energy transition, but we're not ignoring that it's there. Having more production that can come online, I think would be good for Iraq and good for everybody else. We have to get to 24-hour electricity across Iraq to encourage more entrepreneurship, to encourage more small businesses, to take away the politics from it. I think Prime Minister Soudani, who I have respect for, is understand that that's the direction that we have to get there. I think we just have to, we the United States have to help with what's the roadmap of getting there. But this is the last chapter. We have to get this right. And I think there's no time to waste. And the United States will continue to do everything we can to support Prime Minister Soudani, to support our friends in Erbil as well, and to be able to get to a more prosperous Iraq. Because I believe a more prosperous Iraq at the end of the day means not only more stability, but a more prosperous region across the board.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course. Thank you for having me.